new book, Love Shadow. And it's simultaneously a book launch here at Dartmouth, as well as a roundtable discussion. And envisioned as such, each brief presentation intends to animate further discussion all round. Each speaker occupies a chaired university professorship, and all have written monographs and essays well known to all of you. Each interlocutor in this evening's roundtable has also engaged topics and questions taken up in eloquent elaboration in the occasion for this evening's discussion, Paul A. Beauvais' Love Shadow. So to introduce a variation on the conventions of academic introductions, I intend to cite key passages from the writings of each of the presenters wherein these topics resonate. Let's begin first with the person listed first on the advert, Bruce Robbins. I'm going to introduce Bruce, R.A., and Hortense first, and then introduce Paul Speak, and be followed by, in order, of the presenters. Bruce Robbins is the Old Dominion Foundation professor in the humanities at Columbia University, where he's taught in the Department of English and Comparative Literature since 2001. Robbins works mainly in the areas of 19th and 20th century fiction, literary and cultural studies, and post-colonial theory. He describes the actual scope of his interest with admirable modesty. In quotes, "I teach literature at Columbia, but I also write as an amateur about social and cultural theory, philosophy, history, and politics." Robbins is the author of 6 books: Upward Mobility and the Common Good, Toward a Literary History of the Welfare State, Feeling Global, Internationalism in Distress, Secular Vocations, Intellectuals, Professionalism, Culture, and The Servant's Hand, English Fiction from Below. What I consider a trilogy, Perpetual War, Cosmopolitanism from the Viewpoint of Violence, companion volume entitled The Beneficiary, Cosmopolitanism from the Viewpoint of Inequality, and his upcoming book on atrocity, began in 2012 and will be completed in 2021. In 2013, he directed a documentary film entitled Some of My Best Friends Are Zionists. His short documentary, What Kind of Jew is Shlomo San, was released by Mondoweiss in the spring of 2020. He's also the editor or co-editor of Intellectuals and Aesthetics Politics, The Phantom Public Sphere, Thinking and Feeling Beyond the Nation, Immanuel Wallerstein and the Problem of the World System, Scale and Culture. He's been a member of the Boundary 2 Collective since '91. Here are the key terms: hope, the disciplinary rationale for dealing with literature, imagination, secular humanism. These are terms, the problems to which Robbins' writings often return, that will, I think, also resonate in this evening's seminar. In The Beneficiary, the first of these 3 terms converge and collide. A beneficiary, as Robbins cannot not observe, is one whose privileges and comfort depend in various direct or indirect ways on the suffering of others. Optimistic efforts on the part of beneficiaries to redress the injustices upon which our world depends often, or usually, risk participating in those very injustices. Throughout The Beneficiary, it is the imagination working with and through these quandaries that generate possibilities that he calls hope. In place of a conclusion, Robbins quotes a John Berger sentence that might also well have served as an epigraph to Love Shadow. The world is not intolerable until the possibility of transforming it exists, but is denied. While on the topic of sentences that approach the proverbial, here is Robbins on secular humanism from 2011, brought back to mind in a recent Boundary 2 interview. In quotes, "To be secular is to know that not all mysteries can be transformed into puzzles, let alone solved. It means that our words should not ask for what they can't have. If it makes sense to speak, as Levine does, George that is, of the sacredness of a world without a telos, surely it makes more sense to speak of the profanity of such a world. Assuming we want as far as possible for our words to have meaning, which is one of the more feasible ways to ensure that our lives too are meaningful as possible, it might be better to give up on the sacred and on enchantment in all its varieties. There are other and better ways to say nice things about the world, close quotes. R.A. Judy is professor of critical and cultural studies in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh. His published scholarship spans multiple fields from Arabic literature and Islamicate thought to critical race theory and Black studies. Among some of his more prominent publications is Forming the American Canon, the Vernacular of African Arabic American Slave Narratives, off-cited editions and volumes from Boundary 2. He has edited are the Tunisia Dossier and Sociology Hesitant, W.E.B. Du Bois' Dynamic Thinking. His latest book is Sentient Flesh, Thinking in Disorder, Poesis in Black. It was published by Duke in 2021. Deforming the American Canon is now only beginning to receive the attention it deserves. And I'm going to do all I can to make certain that book is republished quite soon. Sentient Flesh, which in a certain sense called attention to disforming the canon, thinking in disorder, poesis in Black, draws on numerous fields from literary theory and musicology to political theory and phenomenology, as well as Greek and Arabic philosophy. Judy engages literary texts, performative practices such as music and dance that express knowledge and conceptions of humanity oppositional to those grounding modern racialized capitalism. Operating as critiques of Western humanism, these practices and modes of being in the world, which he theorizes as thinking in disorder or restless imagination or poesis in Black, foreground the irreducible concomitants of flesh, thinking, and personhood. In the following passage from a recent interview with Fred Moten, R.A. engages the question of the human, poesis, sentient flesh, and violence. In quotes, with regard to the poetic and the human, for example, poesis as a modality of generative creative representation, mimesis, specific to the biological species Homo sapiens, is a key concept for the way in which Aristotle tried to define anthropos, what it is to be human. As the Elamicate philosophers understood, taking up the Alexandrian school's inclusion of the poetics in the Organon, the issue of poesis is related to Aristotle's effort at addressing a problem is still with us. He's clearly meaning that capacious Greek sense of poesis. It's all art, it's all creativity, it's all metaphor. So, R.A. completes this line of thought, my persistence in posing the question, who can speak for the human? Or even, how is the human? This is part of the commitment to understanding the multiple situations in which, let us say, human intelligence predicates itself on violence, declaring beauty, truth, the good. There can be no generative history of the species, R.A. concludes, if these cancerous growths are banished from sight. We must keep track of their traces. Hortense J Spillers is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor at Vanderbilt University, author of Black, White, and in Color, essays on American literature and culture, co-editor with Margaret Price of Conjuring Black Women, Fiction and Literary Tradition, editor of Comparative American Identities, Race, Sex, and Nationality in the Modern Text. It is her essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book that exhibits the performative capabilities William Blake attributes to visionary forms dramatic, and Paul Beauvais might call critical poesis. Concepts and notions from Spillers' Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, and American grammar book, Captive Flesh, Vestibularity, have been taken on by sundry emergent and residual academic formations in what seems an ever-expounding legacy. Saidiya Hartman, in discussing its influence on Afro-pessimism, for example, says that what Spillers is concerned with really the human is a metaphysical construct that can only be read by an analysis of the specific anti-Black violence that names, marks, and positions the Black women. This reading heavily influences Afro-pessimism framework that it firmly situates anti-Blackness as foundational to the human, as a political ontological construct. That is, anti-Blackness creates the founding distinction between human and anti-human, or importantly, non-Black and Black. Now, of course, Hartman's observation of what is a large debt Afro-pessimist discourse owes to Hortense Spillers' Black feminist scholarship is only one of the ways in which this essay has not only influenced, but also transformed multiple disciplinary formations. Disparate notions and topics literary scholars single out have also supplied structures of feeling in inaugural terms for decolonial studies, racialization and sexualities discourse, intersectionality. This is the case because Spillers has given us a new grammar that is less concerned with pinning down Black life and culture to a word or a phrase, and more concerned in articulating the complex networks, historical, cultural, literary networks that have shaped and continue to shape the contours of intramural Black life. Beginnings, the pressure of the real, rupture, are revivified when Hortense Spillers writes, I quote, "The symbolic order that I wish to trace in this writing, calling it American grammar, begins at the beginning, which is really a rupture and a radically different kind of cultural continuation. The massive demographic shifts, the violent formation of a modern African consciousness take place on the sub-Saharan continent during the initiative strikes which opened the Atlantic slave trade in the 15th century of our Christ, interrupted hundreds of years of Black African culture. We write and think then about an outcome of aspects of African American life in the United States in the pressure of those events." Paul Beauvais, now turn to the occasion for this roundtable, is distinguished professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh and editor of the peer-reviewed academic journal Postmodern Theory, Literature, and Culture, Boundary 2. Beauvais has been a member of the Pitt faculty since 1979 and was named a distinguished professor in 2005. He's authored 7 books in the wake of theory: Mastering Discourse, The Politics of Intellectual Culture, Destructive Poetics, Heidegger and Modern American Poetry, Early Postmodernism, Foundational Essays, Intellectuals in Power, A Genealogy of Critical Humanism, Poetry Against Torture, Criticism, History, and the Human, A More Conservative Place, Intellectual Culture in the Bush Era, and Love's Shadow. Beauvais agreed to accept the position of editor of the prestigious academic journal Boundary 2 in 1988, when Duke University Press acquired its copyright and became the journal's publisher. And by my last count, he has edited close to 130 volumes of the journal. While Paul might not, I consider the last 3 monographs I just mentioned, Poetry Against Torture, Criticism, History, and the Human, A More Conservative Place, Love's Shadow, a kind of trilogy. For reasons I do not have time to elaborate, I also consider Paul's project over the past 15 years a critical reimagining of it's a creative reimagining of the critique he directed against Kant's anthropology in Intellectuals in Power, A Genealogy of Critical Humanism, wherein he writes, "I show that at least since Kant's anthropology, secular critical humanists have willfully represented themselves as essential to the progress of the species and have done so in images that represent them as leaders, as representatives, or sublime masters." And now, instead of just citing key phrases, I am, for the sake of those who might not yet have read all of Love's Shadow, turn to 3 terms that I'll risk creatively reimagining in order to give you some stakes of the importance of these terms: poesis, criticism, utopian allegoresis, with which some listeners might not yet be acquainted. In writing Love's Shadow, Beauvais renewed his commitments to forms of humanistic criticism grounded in the inextricable relationship between criticism and poesis. Beauvais begins this secular humanist project by describing poesis as, in quotes, an ontological capacity of humans as a species, and the valued place of artists and poets as special, but not exclusive manifestations of that capacity, which also appears in politics, protest, and ordinary life. Then he diagnoses what he calls the poison or specific pathology, which he names utopian allegoresis, towards humanistic life that draws critique and poesis apart. Allegoresis is the name Beauvais assigns to a form of mental activity that is utterly destructive of poesis. Beauvais denounces in particular a system of allegorical interpretation in which the figures of thought in one narrative line, yet impoverished by their rewriting according to the paradigm or narrative which is taken as the former's master code or narrative and proposed as the unconscious or hidden meaning of the first narrative. Critics like Frederick Jameson, who take on the persona of the utopian allegorist, possess what Beauvais characterizes as a severe utopian vision that projects into the future, even when there is no alternative world imagined in that vision, a future lacking an alternative world that a human being can desire to actualize in the present. Beauvais describes as a destructive force masquerading as poesis. When a critic conducts a critique of a present state of affairs in the name of a utopian future, they affect the ruination of the present in the name of a future that, insofar as it cannot be actualized, also figure as a ruination. In order to bring those terms to life and revivify the significance and Love's Shadow, I want now to turn to Paul Beauvais and ask you to acknowledge, along with myself and all of the participants, his great new achievement, Love's Shadow.
Hello, everyone. Is my volume working now? Good. I have to do what Don says. I have to thank everyone of you here on my screen now for agreeing to come and take part in these conversations. And I want to thank everybody else who's sitting here too in another Zoom meeting, yet another Zoom meeting, being extremely generous with their time, and hopefully before the night is over or in time after this, being as generous to me with their questions and criticism as they are with their time and their attention now. I have to give very special thanks to Don, who hasn't mentioned the fact that he's doing, in a sense, a kind of double duty. A week or 10 days ago, we had a book launch formally, and Don was there and spoke extraordinarily well about this book, showing everyone there, including me, that he had substantively taken the book on. He had really come to grips with it. Unfortunately, the other two participants there, and I'm very grateful to them too, were Colin Dyan and Cornell West, because with Don, they had been among those who had so generously endorsed or spoken in favor of this book. But unfortunately, the way the evening worked out, I kept deferring my comments, my responses to Don's review of the book and his questions to me at the end, until the point where a meeting that was scheduled for 75 minutes had to end at the end of 2 hours. So I'm going to try to do something to respond to Don's questions. But I'm going to read first a little bit, which I hope will explain something about the way in which the book works. And I'm very happy to have responses to this. This may seem oblique, but so be it. Writing on style, Walter Pater agrees with conventional wisdom only to depart from it. I quote him, "All progress of mind," he writes, "consists in differentiation, in the resolution of an obscure and complex object into its component aspects." And Pater goes on rather blandly, "It would be," quoting again, "the stupidest of losses to confuse things which right reason has put asunder." His first example of an achieved distinction, as he calls it, is, and I quote him again, his first example is, quote, "the distinction between poetry and prose," or to speak more exactly, between the laws and characteristic excellences of verse and prose composition, end of quote. Appreciating some of what Love's Shadow presents, a knowing and patient observer might see it in these thoughts that begin Pater's essay. Right reason distinguishes between poetry and prose, and so indicts itself in a misprision. Right reason confuses the totality of prose with one of its parts, and so Pater gives us clarity, namely a better differentiation. Prose is distinct from poetry if we think of prose, and I quote him again, "Prose is distinct from poetry if we think of prose as, quote, nothing at all, except something very tamely and narrowly confined to mainly practical ends." As we would expect, Pater gives examples of far more writerly prose, invoking Bacon, Cicero, Carlyle, and ultimately John Milton, to deny the differences between prose and verse, but to require more distinctions that in turn blur right reason's work. Pater is not the subject of this little appreciation, of course, but a critic must enjoy his path to his typically mysterious final solution. Quote, "Sometimes," he notes, "those who make the distinction between prose and verse, sometimes, quote, they have been tempted to limit the proper functions of prose too narrowly. He calls this false economy, and it appears in, quote, critical efforts to limit a priori by anticipations regarding the natural incapacity of the material with which this or that artist works. Critical efforts transform prose into, quote, nothing at all, as that prose sets its own limits to art, which it defines as its other. Right reason in these acts reverses the order of expression, makes technical prose the dominant figure in a binary that obscures not only the light, but the shadows light throws. Imaginative literature, in Pater's language, imaginative literature contains poetry and prose, if prose is literary art. Another facet of that quality, poiesis, potentially so prominent in verse. Poetry is one representation of what Pater calls, a wonderful phrase, that sole fact, end quote, of which prose is another representation. Prose cuts loose from imaginative culture and its foundations to become instrumental, arrogant, and judgmental. Imaginative prose, Pater goes on, and I quote, should be the special and opportune art of the modern world, possessed by, quoting again, a curiosity about everything, whatever as it really is, involving a certain humility of attitude, cognate to what must, after all, be the less ambitious form of literature, end of quote. Love's Shadow attends to style in two different ways. It writes about style, for example, Erich Auerbach's assertion that the Hebrew God is an effect of style, which leads to the institutionalization of an interpretive class with its authoritarian tendencies. Love's Shadow also performs style, adapting elements of the Baroque to the prose about Benjamin, an act of homage, as well as a reminder that the Baroque lacks the necessity Benjamin seems to believe has become part of and made us part of only natural history. It also adapts the modes of German idealism, closely to follow the movement of concept in Adorno, playing the card of immanent criticism to the figuration of repetition, of shadowing. In other words, and to put it polemically, Love's Shadow is with Pater in bemoaning an instrumental prose that establishes its utilitarian priority to the materials under investigation. As with Pater, Love's Shadow disapproves of efforts to turn prose into such positivistic instrumentality whenever and wherever it occurs. It worries most about the tendency to such instrumentality in prose that would define, delimit, and displace poiesis, making it subservient to the practices and iterations defining the tools of such practice. Love's Shadow looks for humility in accepting critical prose as a secondary location of poiesis in the dialogue between art and critical response and expression. Above all, however, Love's Shadow accepts critical prose's obligation to be itself secondarily creative, that is, writerly, scholarly, that is, patient and attentive, and evidently continuous with the art near which it abides. Love's Shadow writes about allegoresis, that is, the interpretive tool for reading all texts as if they were allegorical, or to put it more generously, to disclose the allegorical elements of cultural products. The book stands strongly opposed to allegoresis as a modern version of instrumentality, the origins of and apologies for which lie in grand patterns of thought, power, and expression, with long genealogies revamped to fit the mainstream needs of the state-related institutions of the research university, especially as it was funded by the state during the Cold War, and later as it adapted under neoliberal pressures that withdrew or redirected state support. In other words, in Pater's terms, Love's Shadow takes allegoresis as an example of how prose works in modernity. Allegoresis is thus the book's device for its own writing. It is both particular to the moment and valuable for its history, a figure along the lines of which the book could write out the scholarship of its own preparation and making. While Love's Shadow weighs in against allegoresis for political and cultural reasons important to now, its choice of allegoresis as a subject is as much, if not more valuable, as a device for thinking in prose, that perhaps too strongly at times wants to claim its independence from efforts that restrict critical prose, as Pater suggests they must, when they restrict or displace poiesis. The writerly quality of critical prose would appear in an answer to a question posed by Don Pease in the session launching Love's Shadow. Not only asked if allegoresis were a product of imagination, poison, as he suggested earlier, but if the project of Love's Shadow could write Walter Benjamin again as reimagining his real. The two questions are, of course, one, undoubtedly Benjamin's messianic allegoresis could appear as an effort at reimagining his real. Above all, of course, Love's Shadow could write Walter Benjamin as he lives up against the apotheosis of dehumanizing powers and desires refulgent in Nazi terror, as at other times in Black racial slavery. Love's Shadow could write Benjamin's effort, and in fact it did. Allegoresis names a bit of his effort. As when, however, the book writes about Stevens, it makes no effort ever to comprehend the totality of an author or context. Rob Wilson in Cornell West a week ago asked, apropos Stevens, if evidence from his life would not qualify Love's Shadow's claim that for Stevens poetry required no redemption. The answer to such questions is that they have little to do with the art of the book. There is a kind of positivism in the assumption that Love's Shadow is writing about. The reviewer who spoke about this book at its launch made the point that it is not a book about. And so the reviewer continued, it is weak. It is vulnerable to any question that takes the form of, what about? Pease more deeply asks about the potential for writing Benjamin differently within Love's Shadow's offering to think along. The answer is, of course, yes. But finally, in doing so, and to keep faith with the shadow Love casts, the book would end with a pathos-ridden Benjamin, one weak in the sense of rent voices, when she says he had not the courage to escape from German. The book would then fail because redeeming Walter Benjamin, it would assure rather than wait for acceptance. Love's Shadow puts it differently. Benjamin lacked the imaginative strength to deal with crises and thought himself into a permanent Baroque, a permanent natural history for what was once human life. It is that weakness of imagination, appealing as it is but weak in its results, which would have appeared more strongly if Love's Shadow had written the answer to Don's question. So thanks very much. I'll be quiet and listen for a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And I want to use that as a kind of segue to the first speaker. Bruce, you would have been, your ears would have been turned red given your modesty about your own career. So it's probably good that you missed my introduction. But I do want to recall a certain positioning that you used in your review of Poetry and Torture, in which you set a kind of opposition between poesis and praxis by pointing out that poesis includes the making of shoes as well as the making of poems, but it does not include much of what we look for in the neighboring concept of praxis. And insofar as that neighboring concept of praxis seems to be related to instrumentalization, as Paul has just described it, I'm wondering if there's a more complex relation to the two terms, or whether you simply want to ignore that question altogether and take up what you have prepared. In any case, I want to welcome you as I did before, and thank you for making this session, Bruce.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm really honored to be on this panel with my fellow panelists, whom I'm also kind of tempted to address themselves because of their own work. I did actually suffer from burning ears. Don, listening to you, my image was not visible, but my ears were burning, I assure you. But if you want me to stay under 10 minutes, then I can't talk about poesis and practice. I will say, spending a lot of time in Greece, where you do see poesis, versions of poesis attached to shoemakers and so on, you can be deformed in your appreciation of these terms. But anyway, all right, I'm gonna read what I wrote and not look at anybody because that will throw me off. Okay. I try to remind us, Paul Beauvais writes in the preface to Love's Shadow, against the allegorists and melancholics, against the peddlers of abjection and enchantment alike, that secularized humanity possesses the resources to sustain life, humanity, and responsibility to creation without God and without the affect that takes away freedom and leaves us vulnerable to tyranny and defeat. Readers of this extraordinary book, I want to call it a great book, and only partly because it is so full of and so close to the great books, and offers a creative way of feeling about the greatness of the great books. Readers will find much else to take away with them, but I want to underline this early statement on behalf of a secularized humanity which possesses the resources to sustain life and therefore does not need to seek those resources beyond the secular. One theme developed throughout the book, which I feel very close to, is the idea that pursuing enchantment, a barely disguised version of theology, is not, after all, so very different in its effects from proclaiming your abjection. Both lead to the same place, to melancholy, a sense of human spiritual poverty, a failure to recognize or take advantage of resources of creativity and imagination that are already ours. To entertain the wrong idea of hope, the book argues, is to set yourself up for melancholy. About that, I agree wholeheartedly. The wrong idea of hope, and I say this in defense of the right idea of hope, the wrong idea of hope is a messianic idea. Messianism assumes that history without the Messiah is empty and meaningless, a growing pile of wreckage, as suggested by Benjamin's Angel of History, repeatedly invoked throughout the book as a negative touchstone. The assumption behind that Angel of History, as Benjamin reads it, is that there is no hope within history. How, Paul Beauvais asks, did this ever come to seem like critical common sense? And I'm actually going to call Paul Beauvais Paul, not out of any disrespect, but on the contrary, out of a feeling of great intimacy and friendship. I hope that's okay. To put this another way, if Love's Shadow can be considered positively as a celebration of poetic imagination, it can be considered negatively as a sort of Nietzschean search and destroy mission aimed to extirpate the vestiges of theology hiding out in apparently secular places, including left-wing politics, and the critical approaches that accompany it. The two would come together as a plea for presentness, set against the historian's postponement of the richness of meaning to the future, as argued by Nietzsche in The Advantage and Disadvantage of History for Life. But to say this is to detect a certain irony or ambiguity in the fact that in order to make this Nietzschean case for the present, Paul mobilizes an entire education's worth of past masterpieces. So where does he stand on history? Nietzsche works as a sponsor for the secularism and the suspicion of history, but not so well as a sponsor for humanism. There, I think the more pertinent figure is Edward Said, for whom Paul and I share an outsized admiration. On the other hand, I'm not sure that what humanism means to Paul is also what it means to Said. Said's turn to humanism after the publication of Orientalism seemed, at least from the outside, mainly political and pragmatic. As he did more and more directly political speaking and writing, I think Said found that Foucault got in the way, that a commitment to humanist universality was required in order, say, to convict Israel and the US as Israel's prime supporter of hypocritically violating norms they supposedly endorsed. Foucault did not encourage normative talk. Norms, on the other hand, were common ground with Chomsky, whose strong relationship with Said is one of the revelations of the recent Timothy Brennan biography. Maybe everyone else knew, but I didn't, that Chomsky had been the first reader of the first draft of Orientalism. The connection with Chomsky helps me think of Said as a real, if somewhat belated, figure of the 1960s, formed by resistance to American militarism in Vietnam, as well as by the plight of the Palestinians and US responsibility for it. I don't imagine that Paul, he can speak to this, is very enthusiastic either about the utopian impulse of the 60s or about the unavoidable association between that period and identity politics. But it helps to be reminded that the 1960s also had a universalistic impulse, whether in friction with or perhaps within identity politics. And you see it in Said's loyalty to humanism. Humanism is either a sort of wimpy thing to champion. Yeah, of course, we're all in favor of humanism, or else it's a really audacious thing to champion. Are you returning us to the criticism of the 1940s and 1950s, when white men took for granted that their reading of a poem was valid for everyone? In literary studies, the main legacy of the 1960s was to tear down what passed for humanism, meaning, to put this very crudely, that the great works of the past spoke directly to the present without interference from history, and spoke in a voice that was not inflected by such historically shifting matters as gender, race, or sexual identity. What has been called the historical contextual paradigm of the last half century comes straight out of the politics of the 1960s. So what would it mean today in literary studies to stand up for humanism? How could that mean not standing against what we have come to think of as history? How could it not mean that the great historical relativizing of literary interpretation that happened as a result of the 60s movements should be rolled back? How could it not suggest that in this sense, history doesn't matter? And if it doesn't matter, then it would seem that we are in danger of going full circle. The time that has gone by would be meaningless, and terms like abjection and melancholy would, after all, be quite pertinent. Edward Said did tend to see the profession of criticism as fundamentally lacking, to put it politely. That's part of his sense of himself as a misfit and an outsider, out of place. I was generally too cowardly to argue with him at the time that the whole profession was made up of people who thought of themselves as misfits and outsiders, meaning that it couldn't really be true of everyone, or just him, and that the respect he got from the profession was evidence that the other critics couldn't be as bad as he seemed to think they were. This is a point I want to raise about Love's Shadow as well. While complaining about critics who see only ruins around them, it seems to me that the book makes criticism itself into a kind of ruin. Its idea of the critical present is a catastrophe. Paul and I are the same age, I think within months. So I am emboldened to say to him with less constraint what I was too scared to say to Edward Said. The respect that he, Paul, has won for his work from his fellow critics is strong evidence that those other critics cannot be as dumb and hopeless as he seems to think they are, especially when he talks about success and official criticism. One of my favorite lines in the book is also one of the shortest. Why Hamlet and not The Winter's Tale? Why should our paradigm of the highest art be tragedy and not, say, comedy or romance? But to ask is to be reminded of the oddness of taking aim at Frederick Jameson. Jameson certainly does make use of the utopian imagination, but he also has Beauvais' own preference for the genres of comedy and romance over the genre of tragedy. Jameson is utopian, but he's not melancholic. Yes, his critical method is allegorical. Allegory, for Paul, postpones meaning to the future, thereby destroying beauty in the present or the presentness of beauty. But to me, Jameson's career suggests that you can have allegory without melancholy. In general, Paul is pretty hard on academic critics. Academic critics, he tells us, come to work on art and culture, prepared with ways of speaking that are recognized within official culture. While arguing against capital from within the richest elite institutions in the most inhumane capitalist society history has known, their rhetoric, he means the rhetoric of resistance, has garnered all the official rewards on offer from the most established professional organizations and liberal institutions in the United States and elsewhere. What it has not done, I'm still quoting, is come to works of art ready to be driven from approved positions by those works. The test of true criticism, according to this argument, is to be driven from approved positions, where any position that has been approved or professionally rewarded is assumed to be undeserving. If you are a true critic, then you are humble, and you permit yourself to be driven from your position, whatever that position might be. Test of true criticism is not to be approved, even by yourself. It's a humility test. I quote, critics must know their humility, that is, the limits of what they perceive and bring. At the risk of seeming insufficiently humble, in my own humble opinion, I have no equal in the art of self-deprecation, I will say that the humility test for criticism seems to me no better morally or aesthetically than any other pre-established standard. Two final questions. This really is the end. One, are the resources that secular humanity most needs a direct, unmediated appreciation of artistic beauty in the present, or access to what Paul calls in Poetry Against Torture, the inherited resources of human achievement? There is, of course, common ground between them, but each also has an extreme version that is quite opposed to the other, an extreme of presentness in the case of beauty, an extreme of pastness in the case of human achievements. And neither exhausts our understanding of what historical fullness might consist of. Question number two, is historical memory historical in the strong sense, that is tied to particularity of time and place? Or on the contrary, does it float free of time and place to form an eternal conversation of great but decontextualized minds, as in the old-fashioned humanism of the Great Books programs? Great Books programs encourage a kind of exile from society's present. But it's not clear either that this exile deserves the modifier historical, or that it would satisfy Paul's political criteria. The question I would tack on after my extremely pleasurable journey through Love's Shadow is whether Paul's criteria are still as political as they were in Poetry Against Torture or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, for those comments. Let's acknowledge that very strong critique, which is calling attention to the relationship between what Paul calls historicality and what is usually understood as history. And that does not introduce as a kind of way of separating what Paul has elaborated, the distinction between a St. John's course in literary masterpieces and an anagogic imagination that is always under the pressure of the real. There are terms that seem to be missing in order to produce certain transitions that would enable an engaged conversation to take place. That said, I want to turn to R.A., who, as I understand it, is going to take up the genealogy of allegory itself as it is both conceptualized and reimagined by Benjamin Auerbach as well as Adorno. R.A., thank you so very much for agreeing to be part of this discussion, and congratulations on your great book, Sentient Flesh.
Thank you, Don. Of course, having listened to Bruce, I regret agreeing to go second, and I'm very much of a mind to say thank you all for inviting me, but I'm going to go now. I don't know if I can at all match the probativeness of Bruce's comments, also because there's some overlap. This is a book that I have engaged for some time now, and the publication of which I truly welcome. It's the fruition of a lot of conversations with a lot of people on Paul's part over a long time. And it's a book that is performatively poetic. That is to say that, to push a bit back at Bruce, in which the poesis is a praxis. And I seek to take it at its terms as a kind of reading, as a kind of poetic reading, what I like to call poetic criticism. And of course, it's a book that tells us from the very beginning that its beginning, its Ansatzpunkt, is that day in the Louvre in Paris, when having just meditated for the umpteenth time on Benjamin's 1940 writings, journal writings, Paul Beauvais is contemplating Rembrandt's Bathsheba. That is the beginning of the book. And I want to quote a passage that he writes about Rembrandt, because I think that one is tempted to go to that spot to begin the book and read backwards. But in fact, all of the reading in the chapters leading up to that, and it's the penultimate chapter of 8, are readings that earn that moment that Beauvais has in the Louvre. In other words, he walks us through, and here I'm going to be slightly provocative, the ruination of his own formation as a critic, right? In order to earn that spot where he could, as he says, realize the primacy of poesis over criticism. So, of course, bear with me a minute. He writes in that chapter on Rembrandt, Rembrandt's imagination is secular and worldly. It does not reflect a naturalistic need for art to serve regimes that his love for the human, his sense of its limited possibilities, and its state of being cannot endure, or cannot endorse, forgive me. If Samson's agonized foot is too far from the point of view this love offers, precisely because it records the murder violence of a transcendent God and a political tyrant, then the archangel's dirty soul gives the viewer and the species a point of view outside the traps so well theorized in the official Baroque. If Rembrandt, in this instance, is the artist as exception to the ruling forms of his art, his departure from the Baroque, then he is also the figure who reminds us that the talk obsessed with the official regime against which he turns cannot be at home to his work. As a result, It cannot be either a proper judge of his official, no matter how well it theorizes it, or the adequate amanuensis of a species that needs to learn what poeses might create and offer. Fortunately, and here's the passage that caught my eye. Rembrandt has had critics who paused with his work and let its effects, in Stevens' phrase, replace their own imagination. John Berger is one of these critics, and he notes that while Rembrandt profited by the liberties won by the Baroque, the dislocations in his paintings are in no way similar, for they are not demonstrative, they are almost furtive. There is something almost furtive about Paul's reading of our moment and his reading of the problems of allegory. There's definitely going to be something furtive about whether or not I take up the genealogy of allegory in my comments. I'm stuck to 10 pages, 10 minutes rather. And what I wrote was frankly 20 pages of notes, and that definitely is not 10 minutes, so I'm not going to race through them. So I'm going to make certain references and hints. And I do mean to say, yes, there's something amazingly furtive about Paul's accounts and the company he keeps. One point of furtiveness is early on in the book, and that's Fry, and a certain deployment of Fry, where he writes, in The Anatomy of Criticism, Fry famously wrote, "It is not often realized that all commentary is allegorical interpretation and attaching of ideas to the structure of poetic imagery. The instant that any critic allows himself to make a genuine comment about a poem, he has begun to allegorize. Commentary thus looks at literature as, in its formal phase, a potential allegory of events and ideas. Jameson might agree with Fry's conclusion that all textual readings are allegorical, but his value schema is not Fry's schema. Fry did not value commentary. He understood that allegoresis made imaginative verbal expression into a servant of favored ideological discourse. In effect, he licensed Jameson's inversion of Fry's rather deepest worry. Jameson became a powerful improviser, searching for modes and movements that legitimated new academic ways of speaking, or rather that legitimated new academic ways of speaking. These in turn presumed the truth of certain extra literary, political, and economic beliefs. Of course, improvisation has goals, and Jameson's career suggests two words for his: hope and allegory. This invocation of Fry gave me great pause for any number of reasons, some of which Bruce's remarks about the trajectory of criticism and the constitution of the literary canon have to do with, right? And the moment of the 60s and the 70s, although I have a different take about whether or not the 60s was altogether utopian in all of its expression. It depends on whose 60s we're talking about. But this point in the text, I had to ask, and it goes precisely to Paul's critique of allegoresis and the distinction he makes between allegoresis and allegory, and the way in which he uses Fry to get at Jameson, but also Jameson to get at Fry. Can improvisation be disarticulated from interpretation, where the latter allegorizes? How is a poetic criticism possible in light of the structures of knowledge which all of us, including you, Paul, work with? That's one question. And that's a question that I want to reflect on Paul's assertion that Rembrandt gives us not the illuminated, but the poetic light that illuminates. There is, however, for me, an important conversation around the relationship between melancholy and allegory, in which Paul lays out far too complicated a genealogy of allegory than I can recount here, but I want to focus on a turning moment in it. And this has to do with the relationship between melancholy, allegory, and the messianic, as exhibited in the exchange between Benjamin and Sholem. And yes, I see your small, Paul, you expected this, right? And Auerbach's interventions. And the passage in question runs as follows, and then my comments on it. When the minor characters, the human beings, with the minor characters, the human beings, the Elohia style creates the effect of psychological complexity through a device that defers absent parts of the character present, in the sense to the preceding and succeeding memories and visions that we understand to exist as total creatures. Now, of course, Paul here is engaging Auerbach's distinction between the Elohist and the epic writer Homer. And this is a distinction around matters of style. And in this account of style, there is more than a little bit of Spinoza, who reads the driving force of the Elohist narrative style to be poetic imagination. It is Moses' imagination that gives the lawful relation between Hashem and the community. In Beauvais' terms, the law is a symptom of Mosaic style. Now, I want to dwell on this a little bit in my final remarks, because it's that question of community that I find still wanting in this lovely book, Love's Shadow. The question of the community of critics, which in Paul's critique seems to be an impossibility, as Bruce pointed out, but also the question of the poetic critic that Paul imagines in relationship to the social at large. And can there be a different kind of relationship than that which has been somehow circumscribed by the Reformation? Now, there's a point at which Paul wants to show how Benjamin and Sholom's investment in catastrophe, investment in ruination, is at the foundations of our current critical tendency towards allegoresis. And again, in showing that, he wants to pay very close attention and make good use of Auerbach again. And he quotes him. It is all very different in the biblical stories. The religious intent involves an absolute claim to historical truth. Necessarily, this restricts and enables the Elohist who had to believe in the objective truth of the stories he told. Why? Because the existence of the sacred ordinances of life rested upon the truth of these stories. In other words, the biblical narrator was obliged to write exactly what his belief in the truth of the tradition demanded of him. His freedom in creative or representative imagination was severely limited. Now, again, this is a particular, I think, usage of Spinoza's critique, which we all know is foundational to our practices and criticism. But this is also a use of Auerbach that I find troubling. Troubling in the sense that it troubles me to think and begin to think about the question of community that's always at play, but not expressly engaged in Paul's writing, hence my use of the term figurative quoting. Now, I think on this point about ordinances, and of course, Paul's point here is to establish, again, clear evidence of how the Elohist, as an exemplary allegorist, creates the hermeneutic structures that kill poiesis, that kill imagination, that restrict the imagination. But I think in that reading of that tradition, Paul, following Auerbach, is in error. The existence of the ordinances of life, which Paul will tell us later on, we know as halakha, to get underway, depend on their doing and not the understanding of their truth. And here, the priest of the temple and the rabbis of the story agree. The relation between Hashem, between the name, and the community is sustained in doing the law. Its fulfillment is in acting, not understanding. Nisa v'nishma. We will do and then we will hear, or first do and then understand. This, of course, is from Exodus 19:18, and it's what the community says collectively to Hashem, accepting the revelation. Now, there, Spinoza shows us that the work of imagination that the rabbis are engaging, and this is his critique of tradition, is profoundly poetic. And that prophecy folds itself into poetry. The crisis that occurs is the crisis of the state, which of course Paul explores adequately, I think, in his critique of Schmitt and Benjamin's interest in Schmitt. So finally, let me conclude by remarking that Beauvais raises an important argument in his reading of Benjamin and Schollem's construing the human as a function of the difference between the chaotic eventfulness of change over time, which they characterize as the catastrophe of history, and the redemptive force of language. Only their construal of redemption robs language of poesis. It is as if they are pointedly arguing against Vico's discerning divine possibility in the most primitive, materially embodied human expression. So that where Vico discovers the invention of divinity in human poesis, in contrast to revelation, Benjamin and Schollem discover only the critical situation, the fall in human poesis, which can only be remedied by transcendent revelation, by this projected future. This calls to mind for me another story about the nature of critical engagement and the nature of allegory, if not allegoresis. And I would say it's not allegoresis. And that's the story, and forgive me for this reference, it's not off topic. It's in keeping with Paul's insistence that we attend to the genealogy of our critical practices and our allegory. And it's a reference that was very important to Spinoza, because as has been pointed out in recent scholarship, Spinoza was a very careful reader of Arabic text, and the allegory of Ibn Yaqan was a very important one for him. But also, there's a passage from the work of Ali called Nahj al-Balaga that speaks to that investment of Spinoza's. And that passage, which is precisely about the relationship between poesis and praxis, I want to say, goes as follows, and I will translate. أعمل دنيتك كأنك تعيش أبدا وأعمل آخرتك كأنك تموت غدا. Now, there is a somewhat paradoxical assertion here. It's anaphoric amed, act, suggests the co-articulation of ethics and work. Act as if your world will exist forever. And act as if the next world will happen tomorrow, right? Literally act as if you'll die tomorrow. Act in this world as if you'll live forever, and act for the next world as if you'll die tomorrow. Yet it's temporal distinction. Ta'ish abadan, you will live forever. Tamut ghadan, you will die tomorrow. This articulates value as ethical judgment from the world, thereby subsuming human creativity to finitude. In other words, it reinforces the need for robust ambition in human creativity, and doing so in disregard of finitude. But then asserts that when all is said and done, ultimately, that creativity has no value. Once again, the human is articulated in the break between finitude and eternity. Yet I want to say to Paul, being articulated in that break, is that not also a possibility then of a kind of reading, and a reading with and reading along as you do, which does not resolve itself in an authoritarian hermeneutics? In other words, you're very severe on the act of criticism that you yourself engage in, and in a way that implies some concept of community, purity. I'd like to know more about what that is, and makes one wonder, what is the politics of the engagement? Thank you for your time.
Okay.
I always get a smile out of him. Let's see if I can get a response.
Thank you, R.A., for those remarkable remarks in which you critically interrogate the antinomy between praxis and poesis in a way that also retrieves certain previously unacknowledged complexities. This conversation has been profoundly enriching. I want to turn now to Hortense Spillers, who's interested in one of the unasked questions, the relationship between the crisis of European enlightenment or European thinking and crises that were caused by European thinking within what is now called the Black radical tradition that appeared not only before the crisis, but by way of European Enlightenment thinking, and also wants to address the relationship between an understanding the distinction between sight, which is the European primary sense, and touch in what's called the African body. Hortense, it's always wonderful to welcome you back to Dartmouth, especially on this occasion.
Thank you very much, Don. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, everybody can hear me. Okay, thank you so much for this. I want to thank you and Paul for this occasion, and to thank you for inviting me to this panel and the opportunity to talk about this exquisite book. I have to early acknowledge that I am still reading and absorbing this book. So the remarks that I'm going to make, which are going to be pretty brief, will be quite provisional and tentative because I'm still working my way through it. I already have, I think, what's going to be one of my favorite chapters. We can talk about that a little bit later. So following on Don's introductory remarks just a moment ago, I want to pose in my comments two queries that accompany my reading of the text, and they sort of go like this. They're connected in a very rough way, but okay, maybe I shouldn't worry about that so much as just telling you what they are. For one thing, for a while now, I have grappled with the notion of crisis and its implications for African-American life and thought. The crisis of Black life seems especially relevant to our understanding of historicality as it is embodied in both the everyday and the conceptual order engendered from it. As I understand Black radical tradition, it arises in crisis and morphs through spatio-temporal impression points that look different on the surface, but divulge a signature, a mark, and inscription that is unmistakable. It is diasporic, repeatable, and in the totality of circumstance, apparently unprecedented. So from one point of view, crisis in this instance is constitutive. How comparable then is the crisis of Africanity to the one that Beauvais describes in Love's Shadow? If crisis is the defining historical modality to which Walter Benjamin responds and helps to name, and I take it that the Benjaminian moment is concurrent with the Frankfurt School, then critical theory might be thought of as a response to crisis. The conceptual birth issue, looking for a way out of an impasse that is life-threatening. I'm tentatively persuaded that Black radical tradition, W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Cedric Robinson, Angela Davis, among others, and elements of the Frankfurt School gaze at one another across a fairly wide abyss, put there by fulsome circumstantial complexity. But I've been wondering a little more than a decade now, might a bridge be thrown between them? And this is one of the inquiries that shadows my reading of Love's Shadow. The other is this one, The Deepest Sense by Constance Klassen gives us a cultural history of the sense of touch. In some ways, Klassen's reader has already correctly intuited certain conclusions that Klassen draws, the architectural, axiological order that is assigned to the senses would be one example. The supposed superiority of vision over touch and feeling. What she describes as the European eye man versus the African skin man is not confined to fantasy. Displaced onto contemporary cross-racial Congress, Fanon's photogenic object, who resonates well with Klassen's skin man and his proximity to bodily touch, embodies those disturbing elements that get people killed, especially African Americans, by hysterical police force. In any case, to meditate on iterations of bodiedness and touch as these notions unfold in the richness of Beauvai's text is cause for profound intrigue. Another problem I'm working on is related to the crisis I spoke of in the first instance, the extent to which touch is an heir of double supply, how it fully inhabits a contradiction, the very same configuration of gestures, the laying on of hands, for instance, means something entirely different depending on the handler's motives. It chills me to think a scene that must have played out to infinity between the late 17th century and the mid 19th century, anywhere in the young Republic of the United States from Georgia and Louisiana to the Pennsylvania border. A man takes hold of another, and we know it as captivity, torture. On the other side of what is a gossamer veil, perhaps, something that you don't quite see, but it's certainly there in some kind of definite and solid way. But on the other side of the veil of abolition, it could well be the erotic embrace. I must admit that this double sense of possibility blows me away, and I am no less moved to watch the choreography of touch and the bodily touch so prominently and convincingly argued in this magisterial text, which brings me a lot closer to grasping where we are today, touching, feeling, as Eve Sedgwick put it. If I'm not mistaken, we are so alienated from touch, our own and the touch of the other, that our homicidal rage is off the charts. So it's those two things that I would say shadow my reading of Love's Shadow. I'm thinking about them everywhere as I go through this. So I'm sure I will be, I will consider myself an absolute beneficiary of this writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hortense. Three very rich queries. And one is taking you back to the moment in which the 50s is surrendering to the 60s, and whether or not you've acknowledged the significance of that transition, or are repeating the great masterworks ever. RA is going right into your theory of the genealogy of allegory in order to recall Spinoza's relationship to Vico, that is not fully elaborated in your argument. And Hortense is asking whether you're considering the distinction between the crisis that was produced within African thought, the Black radical tradition, before European went into crisis, whether there's a abyss between them, as well as the previously under-theorized relationship between a poetics that presupposes the eyes and the touch that we may have lost relation to, we may be out of touch with. Wonderful lines of inquiry. And Paul, it'd be wonderful to hear your response to each.
Thanks, everybody. That's fabulous stuff. I'm not quite sure how to respond. I could try to respond sequentially. That might take a little too much time. I could make certain more general remarks that could hint at least at some of the answers I would give. Let me, for example, pick up on the word crisis, which seems to resonate in all of your responses. In the text, the word crisis is marked by a kind of gross dissatisfaction. That is to say, it recognizes that the term gains a great deal of familiarity and facility, acquires a good deal of iterability within a context that is historically specific to Western European life and culture in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is famously what's called the crisis of Europe. And we know many different texts. We can point to them because they call themselves by that concept, by that title, by that name. Part of what I understand the book to be doing is trying to offer to anyone who reads it reasons to be deeply suspicious and dissatisfied with that particular pattern of thought, that particular semiotic system, that particular discursive pattern of representing Europe as in crisis for all the various reasons that can be imagined. If you like, you could say, the book I think doesn't say this, but the book leaves this to be said, that one of the problems with the notion of crisis is that in fact it is a European formation, a modern European formation. It has everything to do with, here's another reason for the Schmidt being in the book, it has everything to do with the problems of the formation of the European nation-state system, which is of course an imperial, racist, capitalist regime, which it gestures towards. So in a way, the book is saying that there needs to be something that is outside the category of European crisis as a modality. I think the book also believes, and here I'll use the word very loosely, the book also believes a little bit in the nominalist effect. So if you speak endlessly of crisis, you induce crisis, or at least you induce whatever comes to be understood as crisis. Or put it yet another way, different intellectuals, different moments, different traditions, other words might have been used to designate the situation in Western Europe as they were used by other people outside of Europe and as they were used by other Europeans at the same time. It is interesting to me that the term crisis is the one of the ones that came to become became normative, and is then transmuted into what we think of as critical work. Here we think of the Frankfurt School, if you like. into the category of critique, into the fashion of post-critique, and so on and so forth. So the book is aware of the congealed nature of that set of conversations and terms. And of course, as congealed suggests the viability of other categories. It opens the door. As the book says at the very end about Cavell and the Winter's Tale, it works to open thresholds towards other things, right? Now, among those other things could well be what we would call here Black radical thought. I mean, we could invoke C.L.R. James writing about the revolution, at the same time himself invoking the rights of man in the French Revolution, and we would then have once again an entanglement, right? A kind of entanglement in the most classic sense of traditions of crisis, freedom, struggle, and so on. And we could then say, you know, these are things, integuments, which are foundational, and therefore, as Hortense says, we could perhaps not build a bridge between Black radical thought in the 20th century and the Frankfurt School, but realize it's already there, right? It's there for long reasons and long histories. We could say that. We could also say, regarding, for example, the Spinoza, that the Spinoza objection is preempted by the Socrates chapter. That the problem with the Spinoza is that the book says from the beginning, tell me nothing about philosophy, I disregard it. And also, it would say, tell me nothing about argument, because this is not a book that makes arguments, or if you read it as making arguments, feel free to do so. But argument is not necessarily the way in which I would imagine the book exists. In one of the strangest moments of my academic life, a couple of the external readers of this manuscript in 2019 at the Harvard Press were at first bewildered and then happy at the fact that the book seemed to be recursive and wandering and woven and so on and so forth. I've tightened it a lot since that time, but they were struck by the fact that there were not the characteristics of a book that looked like a thesis, definitions, statements of purpose, clear lines of development, and so on, the absence of which I suggest at least hints at the idea that since the book rhetorically and polemically says, the hell with philosophy, means that arguments based on, or claims based on notions of argument and so on and so forth, are going to be by the author of the book seen to be, well, yes, of course, but I told you what's wrong with that entire genre of things. And you can do it, but I'm not going to take it seriously. I'm not going to take it to heart because it's philosophy, for example, including our friend Spinoza in that case. So since the book doesn't make argument, it's not correctable by argument or by claims about argument, about consistency. That's one of the ways in which the book is, I think, somewhat different. What's interesting in all of your responses to me is how the book is provocative on the one hand, produces thought in each of you, and to come back to one of the points that Bruce was making, either offers an invitation to move away from a position, to revise a position, or to reconfigure a position, or to reaffirm a position, any one of those different things, all of which fall within the spectrum of what I would call, not the book, but I now, it's apart from the book, in this moment would call an ethics of humility, right? Because there is no brutal effort to allegorize the book and make it an icon, right, of late neoliberal capital that, despite itself, shows itself to be unequal to its moment because, you know, it has not given a proper account of the economic, political circumstances that have enabled it, and so on and so forth. I'm alluding here, of course, to Jameson's kind of objection to Said's reading of Conrad. All right, so that would be the kind of antagonistic response that I would describe as lacking humility, were that kind of response to come to the book, because such a response would, in terms of the book now, not I, but the book says, it's wrong to take Baudelaire so seriously. You should instead have taken Van Gogh much more seriously. And if you take Van Gogh seriously rather than Baudelaire, you don't have Benjamin, or you don't have the Benjamin that we understand. Some people want to argue about the quality of Benjamin's work. That's fine. I'm not interested in that. But we don't have a certain idea of what is going on in Benjamin, which in turn depends upon Benjamin's own understanding of modernity, Baudelaire, and so on and so forth. So here we have an interesting balancing act, if you will, right? That's available for thought. Van Gogh says Benjamin paid no attention to Rembrandt. Consequently, he concludes the wrong things. And then we read Benjamin and we find Benjamin has no attention to Van Gogh. And so I know Van Gogh's letters on art in the Louvre about Rembrandt. And I find it noteworthy that he says, in a way that is significant simply because it's metaphorical. The problem with Rembrandt is with Baudelaire is he walks too fast. He passes by. He's confident in his gestures. He's assured in his patterns. If you like, we could make it this Jamesian moment. We could say he's habituated, right? Or he's comfortable in what the qualities that we all know his own qualities, which he represents in Constantin Guy, right? Which are not the qualities Van Gogh would urge upon us. So we've made a choice to align one set of critical patterns over against another set of critical patterns. My comment originally in my opening remarks, picking up Don, and now to return to all of you, but especially to what Ronald has been saying, is that of course it's possible to tell other stories apropos this book, right? It's always the question that can be posed to the book that goes something like this, but what about? And as a piece of work, the book doesn't really care about that question. Just as we might say, that question is more Baudelairean in relation to the Louvre than Van Gogh would say it should be in relation to the Rembrandt, right? So the Rembrandt does various kinds of work to which you can say, well, what about the problem of flesh? Does it matter that he's painting Jewish flesh? And we know the problem of Rembrandt in the Hebrew is profound and studied and written about forever. We can't really answer that. We have no idea what that flesh looks like. But that begins to open us towards the spaces of differentiation and communication, which is contained in what Hortense is reminding us to think hard about, right? So I'm satisfied to say simply that the book is provocative. It's not going to be necessarily responsive. I don't think the author feels that the author can be responsive for the book, right? So as I mentioned in the first remarks earlier on, Rob Wilson last week said, well, what about these other moments in Wallace Stevens, where Stevens seems to be Christian? I'm not writing, or the book is not about Wallace Stevens. The book is writing out an entire series of concepts, figures, texts, plays, allusions, not just to the great books, but across not only the Western traditions, but others in part as well. And it sits there. It sits there. And, Bruce and I have argued about profession and professionalism for 30 years, maybe, right? So we could continue that kind of argument, and the book would provoke it. And it invites it in a strange way, right? Ronald and I have, for a long time, had arguments about the priority to be given to lines of thought that stand in primary relationship or important relationship to what are self-described and institutionalized as philosophical writing, even as marginally complicated a philosophical figure, but a major figure is Spinoza, right? I would also go back to the Spinoza-Auerbach business. The Auerbach, I would claim in this point as an example, right? He's not trying, as it were, to get it right, about the Ellulist. Right? He is making, among other things, picking up the historical term now, he's making a motivated, rhetorical political intervention in the formations of knowledge without attempting what would approximate a positivist solution to the question, does he have it right, in talking about that issue. So for him, what matters, of course, is the explication of the formation of that very power and force which is destroying him and his people. If you want to speak about the problem, go back to the Hartman quotation that Don offered early on, speaking about Hortense in Black pessimism or Afro-pessimism. And that is to say, Auerbach speaking as a person who has become inhuman, non-human, extra-human, outside the category of the human, right? Choosing from the point of view of the non-human, the defined non-human, to designate some of the forces and means of which the processes that produce him and others like him as unhuman. That needs to be understood. It needs to be thought about, right? That's not something which has to be gotten right. It's not, Auerbach's book is not in that sense scholarly in the way, for example, Curtius's writing could be thought to be scholarly. So anyway, I don't know if these are in any way answers to, or respond, they're more responses, right? In the name of the book, I guess. Yeah, Bruce, sorry.
No, there's no sorry. I just thought Don, if it's okay, I would piggyback a little bit on something that Paul said. Is that okay?
Don,
So-
you're muted. We can't hear you.
Absolutely, Bruce.
Okay, great.
Yes.
So when, Paul, you were responding to what Hortense said about crisis,
Yes.
it occurred to me that I have something to say about your book, which is not an argument. I was very tempted to say that it's an exercise in slow criticism and kind of a case for slow criticism. In other words, the word slow as a sort of antithesis to crisis is something that you could possibly, I don't know, you don't need a selling point, but one of the things I felt reading it is that you are teaching me to go slow, to stop in front of the Rembrandt painting and spend more time there, to stop in front of the Wallace Stevens poems and spend more time, that there was a kind of philosophical commitment. Sorry, not philosophical. No, not philosophical. But you know what I mean. A commitment to slowness. Anyway, and that probably you could, if you wanted to, connect that up to the Africanity question that Hortense was asking, and that you also started to answer, and say there's a dimension here for systemic racism where maybe you have to think slower rather than faster.
Someone recently sent me an email, and at this very moment, I apologize if that person is here in the crowd, as it were. Somebody sent me an email recently saying that the book put that person in mind of the slow cooking movement.
I wrote that.
I'm sorry, Hortense. It was you who said that.
You see, it all fits. It
I
fits.
out to the floor in humiliation at this point. So, Bruce, you see how right you were in making
Yes,
this
I do.
connection.
I do.
You know
I
what?
agree.
Well, you know what the slow food movement is,
Yes,
right?
of course.
Yes, that was a compliment.
I understood it as a compliment. Thank
All
you.
right.
I just,
As opposed to Wendy's, you know.
but it's also a little bit like that moment in Van Gogh where he says about Baudelaire that he walked too quickly past the Rembrandts. Right.
You also, Paul, remark apropos Rembrandt, and I want to engage some of what you said, but you also remark apropos Rembrandt that he was neither Christian nor invested in capitalist slavery, right? And it's a passing remark in the conversation of Van Gogh, and makes one wonder. There's a judgment here, yes, and you make a distinction in your response to us, to me, between argument and judgment. And I wasn't trying to present argument. I was trying to say these judgments open up lines of thought, not in terms of what about, but in terms of what happens when you explore those lines of thought. So your long meditation on the discourse of the crisis of Europe, and of course you invoke all the right people, Husserl, Breton. It's interesting because that crisis too is a crisis that's precipitated by the First World War, and yet the dynamics of that crisis, in spite of Schmitt's wanting to go back to the formations of the liberal nation state, were already at place in the colonies without precipitating the crisis.
The rhetoric of the crisis of Europe is actually pre-World War I. It's pretty prominent in especially the anti-Semitic movement in France in the 1890s, in the French anti-Semitic newspapers and so on. And of course, it comes to a head around the Dreyfus affair. But it is extraordinarily interesting because it also implicates, in a way that now I step away from the book and speak differently, right? In a way that makes me extremely uncomfortable because I have to write about this now in the Henry Adams context. It does an inordinate amount of work, this anti-Semitic crisis of Europe business, in defining the human as that creature that survives precisely by knowing how to get rid of its parasitical double. Does that make sense? And that parasitical double could be a Black man, it could be a Jew, it could be, an uppity woman of some kind, and so on, right? It would be indigenous peoples. These alternative forms, which are familiars but damaging, occur over and over again. This kind of image occurs over and over again in this French anti-Semitism, and it is very powerfully linked to the crisis of Europe writing. And so when I have not had a chance to sort of do a more historical reading in French, because the anti-Semitism of France is long, of course, but back into the 1890s period, this construction is already evidently present. And it is one of the reasons, not incidentally, right, why I am so distraught at the repetition by people like Scholem, Benjamin, Adorno, and others, Husserl, and so on, right, of this rhetoric of the crisis of Europe. It has become for them an unthought meme. And one of the, as I read, I have to say, I have never read Love's Shadow. I am with Hortense. I'm only in the 4th chapter of the book right now. That's true. I've never read it. So what I want to say is that it's all this unthoughtness, which I would like to bring in some way into relation to the book. So to pick up the metaphor of slowness, if it is read slowly, no matter how one asks the what about question, it might be helpful for the reader in the act of working through the book and changing it, undoubtedly, as each of you has changed it in my eyes at least, right? To take something which was for a moment or more than a moment sort of hidden away and let it reappear. So to take a very crude example in terms of academic literary scholarship, for a long time we have been told that we can't do immanential criticism, right? And the way in which the book thinks, and I do want to put it that way because the book is essayistic, right? But the way in which it moves and follows thoughts and so on and so forth, it I think makes a case. It at least offers itself as an instance of immanential critical work that could cause some instability in the positions of those who have been, up until recently, pretty dogmatically against immanential or close reading. I mean, but even though the book itself has at least two or three different, styles of prose in which it carries out close reading, right? So it sounds like German idealism talking about Adorno, and it sounds like 1950s, 60s Anglo-American literary criticism talking about Socrates, for instance. Right? So if we can extend that, if readers extend that, right, if they introduce the problem of spontaneity and they contextualize what's going on, and they then say, as Bruce says, you know, certain things have to be raised as questions about particularity, for example, and spontaneity. Or if we do, Ronald, what you wanted to do, which was to introduce via Spinoza the very question of whether or not another, and this is in keeping with Don's remark to me last week about Benjamin, whether or not there isn't a way to depart from the severity of our Auerbachian position, right? Which I would say, in effect, and I follow it in doing this, or the book follows it, erases the notion of community as important at all, right? Because whatever was community, speaking in the exile of Turkey, gone, right? And Benjamin and Sholem replicating this, right? In their reading of Kafka. But you'll remember, I talk about this. Sholem says to
Yes.
Benjamin in a letter after 1933, Sholem says, if there's going to be, and back to the question of history, Bruce, if there's going to be any real historical importance to these recent elections and changes, we can't just have another pogrom. We need to have the final pogrom. And then he goes on to essentially describe as the necessary desirable effect if things are going to be different, whatever that means in a messiness mind, something that would look like exterminism.
It can't be a cold program.
Yes. You've read the chapter more recently than I, thank you. Yeah, so that's a quite terrifying moment in Sholem, in the exchange between Sholem and Benjamin, you know, and it suggests the, what should we call it? The damaging unthoughtness that goes with the apparent speed of recognition, right? So to come back to Bruce's comment, it's not really, I think the book isn't trying to encourage spontaneity. Although because the book is essayistic and not structured linearly as an argument and so on and so forth, it may seem at times to be free floating, but in the spirit of the essay, it has a kind of entanglement of materials. Sentences, as some of you may have noticed, right? The sentences, even at the level of the phrase, will be elusive without actually being explicit, right? They will echo rather than, in fact, point. And instead of being about, say, Adorno, or about Benjamin, or about Stevens, or about even whiteness in a peculiar way, right? What it is a book of figures. And it acquires the figurations and deploys the figurations and their entanglements without solving all the questions or even asking them, right? But using those figures so a whole series of complex movements can be carried out. Not, I would say, if you wanted me to make an analogy, not unlike the impasto of the Rembrandt painting. All right, texture is one of the things the book argues for, right? And I would say that in this case, the book repeatedly comes back to the necessity of texture, the texture of life, which it would pose, for example, against the concept of a philosophical remark, as well as pose against the rhetorical, political, dramatic position of an extreme Platonic realism, as we see in the Symposium, and so on, and so forth. So within those textures, I think, we can come back to this question of bridging again, but within those, the issue of the texture and the importance of texture, text, life experience, traces, and so on and so forth, we come back as well, don't we, to what Hortense is asking about the differences of flesh, the differences of the communication of flesh, and therefore the difference of the violence of flesh. And the Bathsheba chapter, after all, in a foundational way, is about the difference between Rembrandt's treatment of the Bathsheba figure, who is not a realist figure, right, anatomically, on the one hand, and the figure whom Rembrandt erases from that story entirely, and that is the rapist, David, who was also a murderer. So, yes, of course, not only south of Pennsylvania, but in Pennsylvania, there was a grabbing of people, holding them in captivity. if you wanted to say this, you know, the despicable violence of the murderous David at that point, right, has some kind of at least family resemblance, right, to the violence upon bodies in captivity and capture. Because what does David do, right? He sends his soldiers to the naked Bathsheba and seizes her and brings her back for rape. That's, sorry, Hortense, but then some allusion to Jefferson comes to mind, right?
Yeah,
In moments like that.
yeah.
Because we've talked about that, you know,
Yeah.
1,000 times too. So anyway, I'm answering it too great a length, I'm sorry.
It's
This
lovely.
has been a wonderful session. I'm getting an indication that we've gone 20 minutes over time.
Yeah.
But that means we're well launched. If the purpose of a roundtable discussion in a book launch is to fully engage the vessel, then you are ready, and this is for another key term, for transport, another term that is crucial to your text, and another way of translating anagogias. Thank you to everyone who has come to this, Bruce, R.A., Hortense, and all who have borne witness to this wonderful discussion.
Can I just say again, thank you to everybody, because
Thank you.
the
It's wonderful.
appreciator of Love Shadow from earlier today is very happy that he had other voices here besides his own. So thank you all very much. It's really
Thank
immense.
Paul,
You
thank
know,
you.
you remember the book ends by in the acknowledgements by acknowledging my own private republic of letters, which is all of you people, right?
Ah.
Your community.
Created by
Thank you
you.
so much. This has been a wonderful